Witam Państwa serdecznie w telewizji Wpunkt. Nazywam się Michał Piękoś, a dzisiaj moim gościem specjalnym będzie pan dr Richardem Grievesonem, który jest wicedyrektorem Vienna Institute for International Economic Affairs i dzisiejszy wywiad przeprowadzimy w języku angielskim. Zapraszam Was serdecznie. Hello, Mr. Richard.
Hi, nice to be here.
Hello. So today we'll be talking about a report that together with the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies and with FES you have compiled. The name of the report is Nowy Model Wzrostu dla państw Europy Środkowej i Wschodniej. You have coordinated the writing of this report. It outlines a strategy, a path for Central and Eastern Europe to develop, to change over the years. And before we move on to talking about the problems that occur in the present and what the solutions that you've written down for the future, I would like to ask you a little bit about the past. Looking back, we have now 30 years have passed since the great transformation of Poland from a socialist, centrally planned economy to a market economy. And my question for you is, how would you rate the performance of Poland in terms of the success of the transition when you compare it to other European, Central European countries such as Czech Republic, or Slovakia or Hungary? Has it been a success or maybe not so much? What would you say to that?
Well, I think there are really two ways to think about it. So in relative terms, Poland is a success. I mean, I think everybody outside Poland who looks at this region and looks at the last 30 years sees Poland in this way. It is typically seen by a lot of people as the country that came through these 30 years the best. I mean, that tends to be viewed, in terms of headline GDP per capita performance, where Poland rates very highly in terms of the progress. But of course, there's a lot beneath that. I mean, that tells only one part, I think, of the story. I mean, this whole transition period, I think it's very difficult to talk about it as a whole. As you said, it's 30 years, it's a long time. And it had really three phases. There was the very difficult phase of the 90s, which was difficult for everybody, obviously, including Poland. There were then the years immediately leading up to the global financial crisis. So from about 2000 to 2007, which were very good years for the whole region, including Poland. And then there were the years afterwards, so the last decade or so. And I think a lot of Poland's relative success is actually in this last decade. At least that's how it's seen from the outside. Poland was famously the only country not to have a recession after in the 2008 crisis. And the economy's continued to perform fairly well ever since in headline terms. But as I said, that's the first part. I mean, that's the relative success. Poland is a relative success story in the region. But I think if we look below these data, below the headline GDP numbers, we can also see a lot of reasons for disappointment, or at least some qualification of this success. I mean, if we look, one example is if we look at wages instead of headline GDP, the convergence performance has not been as strong, compared to Germany or the Western European countries. If we look at what's happened to inequality over these 30 years, it's obviously not a very positive story, including in Poland. And then if we just think about the level that's been reached, so as I mentioned, in terms of the rate of growth, Poland is done very well overall in the regional context. But if we still have wages and economic development at 50 to 60% of the German level 30 years on, you compare that to the expectations of the immediate transition years of the early 90s, then of course that is very disappointing in the end. And that's the reason I think why, while on one hand we can acknowledge the relative success of Poland, we can also understand why a lot of people feel quite disappointed about these 30 years as well.
Yes, and the question I've got for you is, you mentioned GDP and GDP growth in Poland, which, as we know, especially over the last few years, has been quite high. And often the neoliberals, they like to talk about GDP growth. The question I've got for you is, how has it panned out for Poland, for Polish people, in terms of, broadly speaking, quality of life? So we're talking about health services, public services, infrastructure, in terms of inequality. When you compare the Polish case to all the other countries that surround us, would you say we are somewhere in the middle in terms of how well we did?
I would say that's broadly true. I would say Poland is somewhere in the middle. I mean, it's obviously still quite far below the development level of a country like the Czech Republic, for example, which also started at a higher development level as well. But then Poland has, on the other hand, caught up quite fast with some other countries. But as you say, if we go beyond this headline GDP, I mean, the character of this growth model and the way it has developed, I would say, in Poland is quite similar, at least to the other Visegrad countries. I mean, Poland is a different kind of economy; it's a much bigger economy, but ultimately, I think the trends that we see are quite similar. So, one has been a lot of development in the big urban areas. So the bigger cities of certainly the Visegrad countries done very well out of this transition. They have really seen the benefits of EU membership. They've seen the benefits of this high economic growth. Once you get outside the big cities, I think that's much less visible. So that's one aspect of the inequality. I think the second thing which really characterizes this model, and what we wanted to emphasize in the study as well, this has all been encompassed with a pretty small state, a pretty small role for the government in the economy, pretty small share of government spending in overall GDP. And that's actually very strange. It's something which distinguishes this region from a lot of the rest of the world. Normally, when economies become more export dependent, and that's what's happened in this region, a lot of the growth, as you know, it's been driven by FDI. It's been building up a big export sector. These economies have become very, very plugged into Poland, but also Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, very plugged into the German economy and ultimately the Chinese, US, I mean, the global economy, and therefore very much more exposed to big swings in global growth. And normally what accompanies that, that's what we've seen historically, is that as economies get more integrated into the global economy and more exposed to all of these swings that globalization generates, the size of the state grows with it, because you need a bigger state, firstly, to redistribute all these gains, which come via the export channel, but also in general to manage the volatility and the social fallout that comes with that. And that is what hasn't really happened in Central and Eastern Europe, in the Visegrad countries, at least not to the extent that we would have expected in other countries. And we've seen in Western Europe, for example. And so that's why I think if we think about this kind of apparent tension between, on the one hand, apparently good headline GDP convergence, apparently good headline growth performance, but not really seeing that mirrored in the quality of public services and healthcare and other things that you mentioned. I think that is an important way to understand that.
Okay. In your report called Nowy Model Wzrostu dla państw Europy Środkowej i Wschodniej, which I believe is available on your website of Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies and also on the website of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, you write that what we need is a new economic model, that the old one that we have followed for the last 30 years is not up to date anymore, and we need to find a new path. And now I've got a question for you with regards to that model. In terms of balance between free market and between state intervention, where do you think in the future, for the next 5, 10, 20, 50 years? Where do you think that balance should fall?
Well, I think the very simple way to answer that question is that in the future, the state, the public sector is going to play a bigger role in the economy than has been the case until now. And I think on a very basic level, that applies everywhere. I mean, I think we have to see the current crisis as in some ways following on from the previous crisis. So we had 2008, we had 2020. And both of these crises have delivered a huge blow, I think, to neoliberalism as an ideology, both at the global level and at the country level. It's very, very clear that unregulated free markets, hyperglobalization is going to bring these crises. And we don't want to have these crises anymore, of course. And so we see, I mean, the whole debate has changed. We see, if you compare how the role of the state is discussed, even in the very mainstream now than was the case in 2007, but even in 2019, I would say it's completely changed. So I think there's a much greater acceptance than there was in the past that free markets, the neoliberal order, has to be much more regulated. The state has to play a bigger role in economic life than was in the past. And I think that applies everywhere. Now, I think the real issue for Central and Eastern Europe and for Poland is that it has followed a more or less neoliberal model until now. That's been the development model. Capital accounts were opened very early. Foreign investment flooded in. A lot of the growth is based on foreign investment, often from Germany, into manufacturing and other related sectors. And the economies of the region, including Poland, have really relied on low labor costs to be competitive in that environment. The German firms especially would outsource to Central and Eastern Europe production, labor-intensive production because of low labor costs. Now, that model has delivered at least headline GDP convergence, as we already discussed. But I think it is more than hitting the limits. I mean, it is more than past. It's more than fulfilled whatever purpose it had. And what we established in the study is that the region is really starting to look a bit stuck in this production, that it's too reliant on production and not enough. There's not enough development in other parts of the value chain. So other things apart from just physically making things in factories. So I'm talking about headquarter services, logistics, sales, all of these things around the production, which is ultimately where the higher value is, where the better paid jobs are ultimately. And that's the way to the next stage of development. The question that we had in the study and that we tried to answer in the study is how to do that. And our conclusion is very clearly, the state has to play a bigger role. I mean, this won't happen if the state doesn't do anything. If the state doesn't do anything, the region will stay more or less trapped in this model where it gets a lot of FDI from Western Europe, but in production, in fairly low value-added activities, and it's not going to develop sustainably, and we're not going to see higher wages and higher living standards in the future if we continue to rely just on this model.
Okay, so you mentioned that Poland, in this part of Europe, is transitioning into the next stage of economy, which hopefully will be more based on knowledge, less based on raw produce or physical labor. So the question I've got for you is perhaps a slightly political one. I would like you to tell me, how do you see, in terms of messaging, in terms of language, the role of the left? We all know that historically the left has always been the party, the political side, which has been on the side of the working people, on the side of the working class. Now we seem to be transitioning to a different type of economy. We are, as you said, entering a new level, new opportunities, but also new challenges that you rightly point out in your report. So how the European left, maybe how even Polish left, do you think should ride on that trend? How do you think it should try to attempt to steer the public discussion in order to be relevant to all those issues, to all those new developments?
I think this is an excellent question. I mean, my opinion is that this is a wonderful opportunity for the left, actually, in Poland and across Europe. As I said, the so-called mainstream of economics has moved quite a bit to the left over the last 12 years or so. These two crises that we've had since 2008 have really changed the debate within economics, I think, and all of the intellectual foundation for a leftward shift in economic policy is there, actually. And I think you see that at the European level. For example, you see how this last crisis brought about a big change in terms of the EU budget, the expansion of the EU budget, what it will be spent on, the common issuance of debt. I mean, all of these things, it's a bigger role for the state. And so I think the change is there, the material is there from the economic side, and it's just, as you say, how to communicate that. I mean, my sense is that the left should focus on a couple of things. One, this crisis and the last crisis have clearly shown that neoliberalism is dead as an ideology, or it's dying as an ideology. It needs to be tamed. It's not serving most people, way beyond just the core constituency of the left. It's not serving most people. And it's time for a completely different way to think about management of the economy. And the state needs to grow. We need a bigger state in economic life. I think that argument is, in the context of these last two crises, quite easy to make, actually. The second thing is that if we want this to happen, of course, we need a good state. We need a state that's competent. We need a state that's properly funded. We need the state to be able to attract the best people to work in the main institutions. That means we need to pay people properly. So we need higher wages. We need a good education system that also needs to be paid for. We therefore need to think about tax. I mean, how do we fund all of this? I think it's time for a different way across Central and Eastern Europe, a different way of thinking about taxation and funding the state and funding institutions properly. And then the third thing I think is social partners. There is a big role in all of this, I think, for trade unions, for example. I mean, what we can see, if we think about, what is the ideal model of the future for this region, I think it would take a lot from, for example, Scandinavia, from what has worked very well in Northern and Northwest Europe, which is actually quite a collaborative approach in terms of achieving higher productivity, better quality, better paid jobs. It has been really a collaboration between the private sector, but also universities, the state, the key ministries, and also trade unions. And that's really worked, I think, very, very successfully in that part of Europe. And that, I think, has to be the model for the future for this region as well. So I think you put all of that together, I think it is actually, as I said, I think it is a very good opportunity actually for the left. What I see in my job in economics is a very clear shift to the left. I don't see that happening so much in politics yet, although of course we saw the victory of the left recently in Germany. But I think that there is an opportunity there for left-leaning politicians. The arguments are all there for them to actually make the case to the public and have more success in the future than left parties have generally had in the recent past in Europe.
Okay, so you talked about social partners, about trade unions, about what the state, what the left should do, what the right path would be. Now, the question I'd like to ask is with regards to the international system and a little bit talk about international relations in Europe. So, obviously, a few years back, we had Brexit, so we saw the UK going economically in terms of trade and in terms of economic model as a result, going its own separate way. Now, more often than not, we hear different leaders of, especially Central and Eastern Europe, of right-wing parties or right-wing government looking either to flirt with the idea of their prospective country leaving European Union, or perhaps distancing themselves from the institutions of the EU. And the question I have for you is the following. Is the EU, as it is today, do you think the only viable facilitator of all this required and necessary change? Or do you see perhaps that what the UK is doing or what other governments are debating, do you see that as a viable path?
Well, I certainly wouldn't follow what the UK is doing. That's my short answer on that. I mean, I think I would answer your question in maybe two slightly different ways. So I don't think that the EU is the only facilitator of this. You know, I don't think the EU has all of the answers from a Polish perspective, for example. But I do think that the best way to achieve sustainable, equitable economic growth in the future for a country like Poland is within the EU. But I think Poland has to do a lot of it itself. I just mean that I don't think that leaving the EU would make those tasks any easier, and in many ways it would make them harder. I mean, the advantages of EU membership are big. You know, in my job, I look at all of Central and Eastern Europe. So not only the EU member states, spend a lot of time looking at the former Yugoslavia, the former Soviet Union. I mean, from all of that perspective, it is still a major, major advantage to be part of the EU. And there are lots of ways that in economic terms that benefits countries. And I think one of the most obvious ones is the EU budget and the access to EU funds, which Poland has obviously had for 17 years now, along with the other 7 Central Eastern European countries that joined in 2004. And in terms of funding public infrastructure and these things, which are very important ultimately for economic growth and economic development, that's obviously that's a big advantage. I think where the challenge in a way with EU membership comes is when it comes to things like state aid and industrial policy. And these are things which we in general are quite in favor of. And in the study, we talk quite positively about these as a part of the future economic growth model, that really there has to be a much bigger role for industrial policy than there has been in the past. Now, that is made more difficult by EU membership. That's true. We cannot deny that. But what we tried to bring out in the study is to say, okay, Poland cannot follow the economic model of Japan or South Korea as they did a few decades ago. That's clear within the EU. But there are still actually many things that can be done in terms of industrial policy within the EU. And actually, in this new period, and when we get to this big expansion of the EU budget and this next generation EU, I think this is all going to become even more important. And obviously, one of the big challenges Poland has is the whole green transition and the energy transition. You know, in many ways, it's a particular challenge for Poland. But I think also there, within the EU and with access to all of the EU resources that are available for that, is still a better position to be in than to be a country like Serbia outside the EU having to do that more or less on your own.
Fantastic. On that note, very educative and very informed note, we are going to bring this conversation to a close. My and your guest today was Professor Richardem Grievesonem of the Vienna Institute for International Economic Affairs. Mr. Grievesonem, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
And thank you to all of you, our listeners. Dziękuję bardzo. Do zobaczenia.